continue with our Answers in August series. We started last week. If you weren't here last week, you can listen to that online. Last week we started talking about the topic of politics and how Christians should think about politics, how Christians should approach the topic of politics, the issue of politics. Last week we looked at just kind of some basic principles about government, and then some approaches that churches and believers, Christians, have taken toward government in the past. And then tonight we're going to focus on really just two passages of Scripture and look in depth at what these two passages of Scripture say. We're going to look at a few other things as well, but these two passages of Scripture will guide us kind of specifically. And then next week, I hope you're here next week, we're going to get into some specific topics, like how should we think about who to vote for, and how should we think about specific issues and policies and things like that. All right? And then, as you know, we'll take the next week off because that is Labor Day weekend, and then the following week we'll have question and answer time, panel discussion with all your pastors here. If you have questions that you're already thinking of, or if you have questions that come up in the next few weeks as we're going over some of this stuff, hang on to those. You'll have a chance to ask all of those on that second Sunday in September. Okay? I said this last week, but I'll say it again. If you're not going to be here that Sunday and want to have a question answered, or if you are planning to be here that Sunday but are just kind of shy and don't like speaking up in front of people, don't want to ask your question in front of everybody, then you can feel free to write your question down and give it to one of us, one of your pastors, or to email it to the church office, to Ms. Chris in the church office, and we'll make sure that we get those talked about, discussed, answered on that second Sunday in September. All right, today though, we're going to see what some specific Bible passages say about how we should think about government, and then we're going to talk about some limitations of government. So first, turn with me to Genesis chapter 9. We're going to be flipping around some tonight, looking at different examples, things like that, but we're going to look at three main passages. The first one is Genesis chapter 9. If you're familiar with the book of Genesis, you might recognize chapter 9 as coming right at the end of Noah's flood. The flood has happened. The ark has landed. They've come out of the ark, and they're kind of reestablishing life on earth. And so we get to chapter 9, we get to verse 5, and it says this: "Surely I will require your lifeblood. From every beast I will require it, and from every man. From every man's brother I will require the life of man." Verse 6 says, "Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God he made man." And so right here at the very beginning of kind of the reestablishing of life on earth after the flood, God gives this principle to Noah, to his family, that there are consequences to our actions. And specifically here he's talking about the action of murder. For someone who takes the life of a man, the life will be required. And so we had this idea of there's consequences to actions, there's retribution even to specific actions, there's justice that will be applied. If you kill someone, then you will be killed. If you take someone's life, then you will be required to give your life. And the reason is because people are made in God's image. Because you're made in God's image, because God created us in his image, there's a dignity that each person has. There's a dignity that goes along with life. There's an importance that goes along with life. God is the one that created life, and so God is the only one that has authority over life. We don't have the authority to take the life of someone else. And if we do that, if we overstep our authority and overstep that boundary and take the life of someone else, our life will be required of us. The consequence will be our own life. But also notice one other point. So there's the retribution, consequences, judgment that comes from shedding man's blood. It's because we're made in God's image. But then look at another point there in verse 6. "Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed." And so not only there's consequences that come to this specific sin here, crime, rebellion against God of murder, there's a specific consequence. If you take someone's life, your life will be given, your life will be taken from you. But God is going to use man to do it, right? And so if you take someone's life, then by man, your life will be taken. And so we're seeing at the very, very beginning here, we go back as far as we can, right after the flood. As soon as they get off the ark, God is speaking to them. This is where he gives them the covenant, gives them the sign of the rainbow here in a few verses. This is that passage, right as they come off the ark. And one of the things that he tells them is, if you kill someone, there's a consequence for that. There's justice, retribution will be had. And that cost, that consequence is, if you take someone's life, then your life will be required of you, and it'll be required by man. And so we have this idea, this principle here, going all the way back to Genesis 9, that God takes vengeance on crimes. God gives out justice for sins, but that he uses man to do that. He uses man to do that. Okay? Let's fast forward all the way to Romans chapter 13. All the way to Romans chapter 13. That's kind of the principle there in Genesis 9. Paul builds on that in Romans 13. This is probably, Romans 13 verses 1 through 7 is probably the main passage in the Bible that deals with government, deals with how Christians should relate to government, how Christians should relate to politics, that kind of thing. And we're going to look at 4 things here. I'm going to read that first. I'm going to read it from the ESV because I like one of the words that the ESV has. He says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who's in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed." We could talk about this passage for a long time, and we could ask lots of questions. You probably have questions that have come up even just as I read that, especially if you had not ever read that passage before. But I want to point out 4 things from this passage. Number 1, government authorities are appointed by God. Government authorities are appointed by God. And I think what Paul's saying here is 2 things. He's saying that the offices, the authority itself is appointed by God. God is the one who has appointed that there be certain offices, certain governmental structures that we're under, that we're to be subject to. But not only that, I think it goes further even and says that God is behind who it is that are in those positions. God is behind who it is that are in those positions. So God establishes both the positions themselves and the actual individuals. Look again at verse 4. In verse 4, he says that whoever's in this position is God's servant. He is God's servant. I don't know if you've ever thought about that before, thought about a politician that way before, thought about a government official that way before, but Paul says that they are servants of God. He says ministers. He uses the word minister also, but those are the same word or similar words, servant and minister. But Paul says that they are servants of God, and they're there for specific reasons. We'll get into why here in a few minutes, but they're there for specific reasons. So they're servants of God. Let every person, verse 1 says, be subject to the governing authorities, because there is no authority except from God. God is the one that has established the authority to start with. God is the one that has established the positions of authority to start with. They've been instituted. Those that exist have been instituted by God. So if you resist the authorities, then you're resisting what God has appointed. Now, there's a limitation to that we're going to talk about in a little bit, right? But if you resist those authorities that God has put in place, you're resisting God who has appointed it. And those who resist it, Paul says, will incur a judgment. There's a judgment coming for that. Let's look at a few other places where we see this principle played out. You can keep your hand there or keep your bookmark there at Romans 13. We're going to come back to that. But look at John chapter 19. John chapter 19. This is Jesus before his crucifixion, and he is before Pontius Pilate, being interviewed by him. Jesus is refusing to answer any of his questions. He's being questioned by Pilate. He's refusing to answer. Verse 10, so Pilate says to him, you do not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and I have authority to crucify you? Right? Pilate's saying, why are you not answering my questions? Why are you not responding to me? Why are you ignoring me? You don't understand that I have the authority to put you to death or to release you, and you're going to have the audacity to ignore me and act like I don't have that authority, act like I'm not in that place? But look at Jesus' response, verse 11. Jesus answered, you would have no authority over me unless it had been given to you from above. For this reason, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin. And so Jesus doesn't say, no, Pilate, you don't have any authority. What do you mean? You don't have a rightful authority. No, Jesus says you do have authority, but your authority comes from God. Your authority comes from God. You would not have that authority unless it had been given to you from above, he says. Let's look at some places in the Old Testament. We can think through a lot of Israel's history and kind of see this point illustrated, but let's look at a few passages. Look at Exodus chapter 9. This is when the Israelites are in slavery in Egypt, and God calls Moses to lead the people out of Egypt. We know that story, I think. Look at chapter 9, verse 16. Verse 13 says, the Lord said to Moses, rise up early in the morning and stand before Pharaoh and say to him. So God's telling Moses what he's to say to Pharaoh. And there's several things that he's saying there in this passage. But look at verse 16. This is one of the things that God says to Pharaoh through Moses. He says, for indeed, for this reason I have allowed you to remain, in order to show you my power, and in order to proclaim my name through all the earth. Why is it that Pharaoh is the head of Egypt? It's because God's put him there, and God has allowed him to remain there. God could have taken Pharaoh out at any moment, and yet he's leaving him there, and he's doing it for a purpose, we're told later, right? At the end of that verse, he says he's doing it for a purpose, and we see that purpose as the passage goes on, the story goes on. But here, it's clear that God is the one that has put Pharaoh in that position, and God is the one that has allowed Pharaoh to remain in that position. Okay, turn to Psalm 75. There's several Psalms that we could read that talk about this, but look at Psalm 75. Verses 6 and 7. It says, for not from the east, nor from the west, nor from the desert comes exaltation, but God is the judge. He puts down one and exalts another. God's the one that raises people up. He's talking here about leadership positions, about government positions, kings, things like that. God is the one that raises one up, and God is the one that puts one down. God's the one that does that. God's the one that's behind that. Look at Isaiah chapter 44. Isaiah 44, verse 28. It is the Lord, it is I, who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he will perform all my desire. And he declares of Jerusalem, she will be built, and of the temple your foundation will be laid. Thus says the Lord to Cyrus, his anointed, whom I have taken by the right hand, to subdue nations before him, and to loose the loins of kings, to open doors before him, so that gates will not be shut. Okay, there's a couple interesting things here about this passage. First of all, who is Cyrus? Do we know who Cyrus is? He's a king of what? What nation? Of Persia, right? He's the king of Persia. And if you know the history of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah here, the kingdom's been split in half. The southern part of the kingdom of Judah that Isaiah is prophesying to is about to be taken over by Babylon. And then Persia is going to come to power, and Persia is going to conquer Babylon. And Persia is going to be the ruling nation. Now, this is not going to happen for many, many years. I'm not sure exactly how many years, but hundreds of years at least. And God's already saying that he's going to raise up a king named Cyrus. He already named him. And not only that, but God says he's the one that's going to raise him up, right? He doesn't say Cyrus is going to come to power. He says he's going to raise him up. He calls him my shepherd. He calls him my anointed one, the one that I have anointed, the one that I've put in that position. And then something else. So that's one thing to notice, that God's the one that does it, and he announces he's going to do it many, many years before he does it. But then the second thing to notice in this passage especially is he's not talking about Israel. He's not talking about Judah. He's talking about a foreign nation. He kind of think back to Pharaoh. He's going to raise this man up and make him the king of Persia, and then he's going to use him as judgment on his people. And so not only is God raising up kings and leaders for his own people, but here we see God's raising up kings and leaders for all nations. And that he's using them as his ministers, using them as his servants, as Paul says in Romans 13, right? That he's going to serve God's will and do what God raises them up to do. Same way with Pharaoh. Two other passages. One is in Daniel chapter 2. And then Daniel chapter 4. Daniel chapter 2, verse 21. I'll start in verse 20. Daniel said, "Let the name of God be blessed forever and ever, for wisdom and power belong to him. It is he who changes the times and the epochs. He removes kings and establishes kings. He gives wisdom to wise men and knowledge to men of understanding." It's God who removes kings, and it's God who establishes kings. God's the one that sets people up. God's the one that takes people down, just like Psalm 75 told us. And then Daniel chapter 4, verse 25. Verse 24 says, "This is the interpretation, O king. This is the decree of the Most High, which has come upon my Lord the king, that you be driven away from mankind, and your dwelling place be with the beasts of the field, and you be given grass to eat like cattle, and be drenched with the dew of heaven. And 7 periods of time will pass over you until you recognize that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind and bestows it on whomever he wishes." God, the Most High, is the ruler of the realm of mankind, the kingdom of mankind, and he gives it to whomever he wishes. So this is the first thing Paul's telling us in Romans chapter 13, is that when we're thinking about governments, we can turn back to Romans 13 now. When we're thinking about governments, when we're thinking about political positions, when we're thinking about even people, governors and political people, God is the one that has established this. God is the one that has set people up. God is the one that has raised people up into these positions. And so we're to be subject to them for the Lord's sake. We're to be subject to them as God's servants, as God's ministers, as people that God is using to bring his will about, to bring his purposes about on the earth. Okay? Let's think for a minute about why governments are there. Why is it that God has set these people up? Why is it that God has set these institutions up? Well, he gives us two reasons in Romans 13. For the first reason, look at verses 3 and 4. He says, "For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Then do what's good, and you'll have praise from the same. For it's a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing, for it's a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil." And I read that from the New American Standard. The whole reason I printed out the English Standard is because that's the passage I wanted to read from the English Standard, and I forgot to. But he says in that passage that one of the reasons God has set up governing authorities and people in those positions is to punish and restrain evil. To punish and restrain evil. He says in verse 3, I'll read it in the English Standard. He says, "For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad." One of the reasons God has put rulers in place is so that they would be a terror to bad conduct. So that they would be punishers of bad conduct. Think back to Genesis 9, what God told Noah. If someone takes human life, there's a punishment that comes with that, and that punishment is going to be meted out at human hands, right? By man, your blood will be taken. By man, your life will be taken. Here, Paul tells us that that's one of the purposes that God has in establishing governing authorities, is that they're to be an avenger of bad behavior. They're to be a punisher of evil. They're a terror to bad conduct. Not only that, but verse 4, he makes it even more explicit. He says they do not bear the sword in vain. And that's a reference, I think, to capital punishment. The governing authorities have the sword, and they use the sword as a punishment to evil. And so we can have a long discussion. We've had it before here in different settings. We could have a long discussion about capital punishment and what Christians should think about capital punishment. Maybe that's one of the issues that we'll talk about next week. But here Paul says that the government bears the sword for a specific reason, and he says here to punish evil, that there are consequences that come from evil, right? Now, that go with evil. Now, look back for a second at Romans chapter 12, verse 19, because this is really interesting. Just a couple verses before this whole discussion about government, Paul's talking in verse 12 about how believers should live, and look what he says in verse 19. "Never take your own revenge, beloved, but leave room for the wrath of God. For it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay,' says the Lord." So when someone wrongs us, Paul says, don't take that vengeance into your own hand. The vengeance belongs to the Lord. Don't try to get revenge yourself. Allow the Lord to be in charge of that. And then just a few verses later, the beginning of chapter 13, Paul's saying, here's how the vengeance of the Lord is worked out. Here's how the wrath of the Lord even is worked out on earth. There are governing structures, there are governing authorities, there are rulers in place to bring about justice when wrong is done. To bring about, to exercise that authority in bringing about consequences for evil, for wrong that is done. And he says that they're carrying out the wrath of God when they do that. Governing authorities are carrying out the wrath of God when they do that. Now, when we're talking about all this, of course, we're thinking of governing authorities and rulers that are doing what they're supposed to do, right? Because people that are in those positions are sinners as much as anyone else. And so sometimes they do wrong. Sometimes they don't obey God. Sometimes people in those ruling positions have to have judgment come against them as well, right? But the purpose that they're there, the reason that God has placed them there is so that they would, one of the reasons at least, is so that they would punish wrongdoing. And there's a restraining aspect of this as well, that as evil is being punished, that restrains evil in the world around us. As people are doing wrong things and not getting away with it, as punishment comes against them, that has a restraining effect on other evil. If you kill someone and you see them get the electric chair, well, that has a restraining effect on you, that you're not going to try to kill someone because you don't want to get the electric chair, right? And of course, that's a huge example, but that works for smaller examples as well. And so there's a restraining effect here that the government has as well. The third reason that government exists, the third purpose that God has established government is the opposite. He's established it, number two, to restrain evil, but also number three, to promote the good. He says that again in verse 3 that we've already read. He says, "For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who's in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval." And so government, on the one hand, should punish evil. On the other hand, government should approve good and should encourage good. Restrain evil, but encourage good. Encourage good conduct. If you do what's good, you'll receive approval, Paul says. In fact, if you look at verse 4, the beginning of verse 4, Paul says, talking about the one in the ruler that's in the position, "For he is God's servant for your good." The reason God has put him there is he's to serve God for our good. Okay? And we can think about how that would work. What are the good things? What is the common good that government is supposed to establish for our good as God's servant? Well, we think about things like peace. The government has a rightful authority to help establish peace in our communities, in our states, and in our nation, and in the realm that those governing officials have authority over, to establish peace, to establish fairness and justice. That when we're done wrong against, there's a remedy for that. When we do wrong against someone else, we're held accountable for that. Protection. The government has a place to provide protection for its people, that we should be able to go out and walk the streets at night and not be fearful for our lives. Protecting us from other nations that might try to attack. Also to establish liberty and freedom. Part of the common good that government should establish is our freedom, our liberty, that we can worship God the way that we want to, that we can follow God the way that we see fit. Also freedom and liberty among, not just between us and God, but between us and other people. That we can do the things that we want to do, and we can gather with the people that we want to gather with, and we can spend our time and spend our money and spend our efforts and spend our energy and our talents and things the way that we see fit. We should have the freedom to live our lives. Flip over with me for a second to 1 Timothy chapter 2. This is exactly what Paul tells Timothy and the Ephesians to pray for. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. He says, "First of all, then I urge that entreaties and prayers, petitions and thanksgivings be made on behalf of all men, especially for kings and all who are in authority. And why should we pray for them? So that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity." We might live a quiet, peaceful life in all godliness, that we follow God the way that we see fit, we follow God the way that we understand the Bible to be teaching, with all dignity. The fourth thing Paul tells us in Romans 13, so he says government is appointed by God, government exists to punish evil or wrongdoing, government exists to promote the good. And then fourthly, we've already talked about this a little bit, he says that governments are there to serve God, right? He says in verse 4, for it is a minister of God to you, for your good. Verse 6, he says, "For because of this you also pay taxes, for rulers are servants of God." The ruling authority structure and the people in those positions are ministers of God. They're servants of God. They're there to accomplish God's purposes. Now, they may not know that, right? Pharaoh didn't think he was there to accomplish God's purpose. Cyrus didn't necessarily think he was rising to power in Persia to accomplish the purposes of the God of the Hebrew people, of the Israelites, right? But that's exactly what they were doing. God had them in those places for those specific reasons. And they're accountable to God. Those rulers will have to give an account to God. So they're there, they're appointed by God, they're there to punish wrongdoing, they're there to promote good, and they are there to serve God's purposes, to bring about his purposes in the world. Okay? There's another passage I want us to take a few minutes to look at in 1 Peter chapter 2. It's very similar to Romans 13, so we're not going to take as much time with it because it says basically the same things. But look at 1 Peter chapter 2. It's only 2 verses, verses 13 and 14. He says, "Submit yourself for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to a king as the one in authority, or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right." 1 Peter 2, 13 and 14. And so again, he says the same thing that Paul says, right? He says that governments are there to serve God. He says to submit to them. We're to submit to them, but not only submit to them, but to submit to them for the Lord's sake. Submit to them for the Lord's sake. He mentions kings and authorities specifically. Verse 14, he says, as sent by him, or to governors as sent by him. And so these authorities, these governors, these kings, these people that are in positions are there because God has put them there. Again, we submit to them for the Lord's sake. And then secondly, he said, or second and third, he says the same 2 things that Paul said. He says, first of all, in verse 14, that governments exist to punish wrongdoing, right? Verse 14, he says, or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers. And then number 3, governments exist to promote the common good, for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right. And so Peter's saying basically the same thing in these 2 verses that Paul says in Romans 13. So if this is how we should think about government and governing authorities, that they're there for God, for God's purposes, God has put them there. They serve under God's authority as his servants, as his ministers. They serve to punish evil and to promote good. They are there to accomplish God's purposes. We're to submit to them. We're to pray for them. What are the limitations of that? Are there any limitations to that? When we look at a governing authority, when we look at a ruler, a king, a president, a congressman, a governor, a mayor, do we look to them and give them the same authority that we give God? Or are there limitations on their authority? And I think you know there are limitations, right? They're put there by God, but God's authority is over their authority. And I've mentioned before that God has put them there for specific reasons, but they're sinful, and we don't always follow through with the purposes that God has given to us. And so someone is there because God's put them there, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they always do what's right, and so that doesn't necessarily mean that we should always follow them. There are limitations to this authority that they have. And so a couple limitations to this authority. The first one is that their authority is under God, like I said. And so there may come a time when it's wrong to obey them. There may come a time when it's wrong to obey them. Now, we should be careful with that, right? We shouldn't be looking for reasons to disobey, right? We shouldn't think, well, I don't like this guy or I don't like this lady, and so I'm going to make an excuse to not obey them and say that it's because of this reason. But there are times when it's wrong to disobey these people in these positions. And so there's several places in the Bible where we see this. Let's look at a few of them. Look at Acts chapter 4. This is probably the one that you're thinking of, probably the one that you're most familiar with, that comes to mind. Acts 4 and 5. In Acts 4, verse 20, let's look at starting in verse 19. So Peter and John have been arrested, and they're come before the religious leaders, and they're threatened. They're told to stop preaching and these kind of things. And so verse 19, Peter and John answered and said to them, whether it's right in the sight of God to give heed to you rather than to God, you be the judge, for we cannot stop speaking about what we have seen and what we've heard. They said, you're telling us to stop preaching. Well, we're going to keep on preaching, and you can decide whether you think it's right for us to follow you or follow God. But we're going to follow God. We're going to keep preaching. We're going to keep speaking about what we've heard. And then a very similar passage in the next chapter, chapter 5, verse 29. Same thing, they're brought before the council. Verse 27, when they had brought them, they stood them before the council. The high priest questioned them and said, "We gave you strict orders not to continue teaching in his name, and yet you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching and intend to bring this man's blood upon us." Verse 29, but Peter and the apostles answered, "We must obey God rather than men." And so if there's a time that comes where one of these rulers, one of these authorities that God has put in place is giving us a command, telling us to do something, leading us to do something that's against what God has called us to do, then of course we choose to obey God rather than to obey men. A few other examples of this, look back in the Old Testament at Daniel chapter 3. You may be familiar with these two passages in Daniel. Daniel chapter 3, verse 18. This is Daniel and his friends, and King Nebuchadnezzar has set up a statue of himself, and all the people are called to bow down to the statue and to pay homage to the statue and even to worship the statue. This is when David and his friends are thrown into the, or his friends, not David, Daniel. Daniel's friends are thrown into the fiery furnace, right? And here's what it says in verse 3, chapter 3, starting in verse 17. "If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." And so here, Daniel and his friends are directly disobeying what the governing authority, what King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And yet they're saying, we're not going to do that because they've judged that it's in violation of what God's called them to do. And in order to obey King Nebuchadnezzar, they would be forced to disobey God. And they said, well, if we have to choose, we don't want to choose. We want to be in subjection to the king because that's what God calls us to be. But if you're forcing us to choose, then we're going to choose God, not the king. A very similar passage in Daniel chapter 6. Daniel chapter 6, verse 10. This is King Darius, and he has signed a decree that makes it illegal to pray. And here's what Daniel says in verse 10. "Now when Daniel knew that the document was signed, he entered his house. Now in his roof chamber he had windows open toward Jerusalem, and he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously." And so again, and if you keep reading, God approves that, right? Both of those situations, God approves of that disobedience. In this passage, if you keep reading, is when Daniel's thrown into the lion's den, and the lions don't attack him. He's protected by God. The other passage before in chapter 3 is when they're thrown into the fiery furnace, and God protects them in there as well, right? So God's approving of their disobedience to the ruler. But in both of these situations, Daniel and his friends are saying, we don't want to be in this position. We don't want to be in a position where we have to disobey the king. We want to obey you. We want to do what you're asking us to do, but you're putting us in a position where we have to choose between you and God, and if we have to choose, then we're going to choose to obey God and not to obey you. 2 other passages that are very similar, one in the Old Testament, one in the New Testament. Look at Exodus chapter 1. Again, this is when the Israelites are in slavery in Egypt. Before Moses leads them out, before God calls Moses to lead them out. Chapter 1, look at verse 17. Pharaoh had made a decree that the Hebrew people were becoming too populous. He was being afraid. He was afraid that these Hebrew slaves were going to revolt against him, and that he would not be able to withstand their revolt because they become so numerous. And so to solve that problem, the Pharaoh had decided that all the Hebrew boys were to be killed. All the Hebrew baby boys were to be killed as they were born. And he commanded the midwives, the one that were helping with the births, to do this, to allow the girls to live, but to kill all the baby boys. And so look at verse 17. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt had commanded them, but let the boys live. So again, they're choosing to disobey Pharaoh because doing so would cause them, because obeying him would cause them to disobey God. And if they have to make a choice, they're going to choose to disobey Pharaoh instead of disobeying God. One of the passages that's very similar to that is in Matthew chapter 2. At the beginning of the gospel, King Herod made a very similar decree. He decreed that all the young boys be put to death. Look at chapter 2, verse 8. This is talking about the wise men. King Herod has sent the wise men to Bethlehem. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child, and when you have found him, report to me so that I too may come and worship him." Okay? So Herod has heard about these prophecies of this baby that's going to be born in Bethlehem. The star appears. The wise men are like astrologers. And so they read the signs of the stars, and the star appears when Jesus is born. And so Herod believes that this baby that's been prophesied about has been born. And so he sends these wise men there with gifts. We know the gifts they took with them. And he tells them, when you find him, come back and let me know where he is, because I want to come worship him also. Okay? But skip down to verse 12. Chapter 2, verse 12. And having been warned by God in a dream not to return to Herod, the Magi, the wise men, left for their own country by another way. Okay? And we think it's because Herod said he wanted to come worship him, but he didn't really want to come worship him. He wanted to make sure that baby was put to death. And so the wise men decided, instead of obeying what Herod had sent them to do, find the baby, come back, report to him. Instead, they returned to their home by a different way. They didn't go back and report to Herod, right? And this is significant because in verse 12 it says, not only did they decide not to, did you catch why they decided not to? Look at it again, verse 12. And having been warned by God in a dream not to return to Herod, the Magi left for their own country by another way. The reason they decided not to go back to Herod is because God had appeared to them in a dream and warned them not to. And so not only are they choosing to disobey Herod, the king, but God appears to them and directly tells them to disobey Herod as a king, right? So there are times when it's right for us to disobey the authorities that are in place. There are times when it's wrong for us to obey them. Obeying them would be sin. But again, we should be careful with that, right? We shouldn't use that as like a loophole to try to find reasons to disobey and say, well, I'm going to drive 112 on the interstate instead of 70 or whatever the speed limit is. But I got to obey God to set them in, right? When I get pulled over by police, I got to obey God, not men. This isn't some kind of loophole to get out of us just doing whatever we want to do. This is something that we should take seriously and think about seriously. And if there's any way to be subject to the rulers that God's put in place, then we should find a way to do so. But if we're put in a position where we have to choose, either I'm going to obey the authorities that God's put in place, or I'm going to obey God himself directly, then we choose God above these authorities. A second limitation, so that's the first limitation, we disobey whenever we're required to disobey in order to obey God. There's a second limitation, though, and I don't really know how to name this, but what I wrote down was realm. There's a limitation of realm. And so think about Jesus. Remember the story when they come to Jesus and they're trying to trick him. We read it last week. They're trying to trick him, the religious leaders are, and they say, should we pay taxes to Caesar? And remember, Rome was oppressing the Israelites at that time. They were living in the Roman kingdom. They didn't have their own kingdom anymore. They were being oppressed by Rome. They're trying to trick Jesus, because if he says, no, don't pay the taxes, then Rome's going to be upset with him. And if he says, yes, do pay the taxes, then the Jews are going to be upset with him. And so what does he say? Well, remember, he tells them to catch a fish, and there's a coin in the fish's mouth, and he says, look at it, and on whose face is on it? They say Caesar's face is on it. And he says, give unto Caesar what's Caesar's, and give unto God what's God's. And so if we think about that, there's a realm that belongs to Caesar, there's a realm that belongs to the governing authorities, and there's a realm that belongs to God. And it's right to obey the governing authorities when they stay in their realm, and it's right to obey God outside of that realm. And so think about some limitations, right? The governing authorities can pass all kinds of laws that are good and are helpful. They can pass laws that are good for society. Like I said, one of their purposes is to establish the common good, work for the common good, that we would have peace and safety and those kind of things, right? Paul tells Timothy to pray for the ruling authorities, that we might live a quiet, dignified life of peace, right? And so there's a realm where the governing authorities have a place. The laws that they pass are good for us and those kind of things, but there's a limitation to it. They can pass good laws that restrain evil. They can pass good laws that promote good, but they can't change someone's heart. They can't transform a person from the inside. That's the realm of God, right? Salvation is the work of God, not the work of the state, not the work of governing authorities. They can't transform society. They can change society some with these different laws that they're passing, those kind of things. They can cause people to kind of modify the way that they behave, right, to live certain ways, but they can't force people to love one another. They can't force people to serve one another. They can't force people to be good to one another. That's the work of God. And so there's a difference in these realms. And the church should not try to take over the government's realm. There's a rightful place for governing authorities. God has put them there for specific reasons, and the church should not try to take that over. There was a time in the history of the church where the church leaders tried to do that. A lot of the Roman Catholic popes back in the Middle Ages tried to do that. And you got the Crusades and wars and things that the church was involved in, and that was not good. But on the same side, the government shouldn't try to take over the church's realm. Government shouldn't try to take over the government's realm, and that's been tried in history as well. The Holy Roman Empire, where the emperor was the one who decided who was going to be pope and the one who decided who were going to be bishops. The Church of England, the Anglican Church, where the King of England is the head of the church, and the governing authorities, the rulers, decided who would be bishops in these different places and who would lead the church in these different places, right? And of course, we have disagreements about even that structure of church government, but there's also a place where the governing rulers should not have that authority, should not be involved there. This is why we believe that the separation of church and state is a good thing. That's historically what Baptists have believed, that's a good thing. Even that phrase and that idea comes about because of a letter that was written to Baptist leaders, where the Baptist leaders were afraid and wanted to make sure that the government was not going to overstep its bounds and start trying to control the churches. That's where that phrase separation of church and state comes from. There's a wall of separation between church and state. That's where that phrase comes from. It was in a letter, I think it was Thomas Jefferson who wrote that letter to the Baptist Association in, I think Danbury is where it was. And in a response to concerns that they had, he said, no, don't be worried that the government's going to try to take over your church. There's a wall of separation there where that's not our place. It's not the government's realm. The government has no place in telling the church what we can teach, has no place in telling the church what leaders should be in place, has no place in telling the church what the mission of the church is going to be and what types of ministries we're going to be involved in. And so there's limitations on these governing authorities when they try to command us to do something that's against what God has commanded us to do, when they try to overstep their boundaries, overstep their realm. We got 8 minutes left. Let me leave it there for now, and we'll see if we all have questions. Okay? So when think about the governing structures, God's put them in place. He's put them in place for specific reasons, to punish evil and to promote good and to accomplish his purposes. But there's limitations to that. And we should be subject to that as much as we can be. But there's two limitations to that, at least. One is the government should not command us to do something that is against what God's commanded us to do. And if so, then we obey God and not what man tells us to do. And then there's different places, there's different boundaries, different lanes that each should be in. The church has its lane and the government has its lane, and we shouldn't try to get those mixed together. Now, that doesn't mean that believers shouldn't be involved in politics, right? We're going to talk about that some more next week, because we're part of the church, but we're also citizens in the in the city, in the state, in the country. And so we do have a responsibility as citizens, but that's separate from our responsibility as believers, as church members. Okay? All right, y'all have questions about any of that or what we talked about last week?